We appreciate you all joining us for our Sustainability Lunch series. We're very excited about today's event in particular. So we're partnering with IWER, the MIT Institute for Work and Employment Research, to welcome Jenny Weissbourd as our guest speaker. Before we kick things off, I just have a couple of quick announcements. A couple of upcoming events that I think you all would be interested in. Next week, we are hosting another lunch series event focused on food tech, specifically in seed technology. So we're really excited about this guest speaker. She actually was a guest speaker for the Water, Food, and Ag Prize last year. And so we're going to welcome her back. So if you haven't yet registered, the QR code is up on the screen here and also on Sloan Groups. The next event is a spring mixer. So each semester, our team will host just an informal chance to connect with students at a local restaurant. This year, we're going to host that mixer on April 17th from 5:30 to 7:30. Highly recommend joining us if you haven't met the team, if you haven't met other sustainability students. We also have some Boston area alumni that will stop by. So the QR code is up on the screen and also on Sloan Groups. And then lastly, we want to promote this year's Sustainability Summit. So this is an annual conference that we help to advise, student-led conference. They choose a different topic every year. This year's topic is all about climate resilience. It's happening Friday, May 2nd, over in the Sandberg Conference Center. Highly recommend joining us for this event. It usually sells out. We invite about 400 attendees each year, and we have a phenomenal program lined up. So if you haven't yet registered, again, QR code is up on the screen. So with that, I am going to introduce today's facilitator, Erin Kelly. Erin is the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Work and Organizational Studies at the MIT Sloan School of Management and co-director of the MIT Institute for Work and Employment Research. Erin investigates how workplace policies and practices affect firms and families with a joint focus on equity, well-being, and organizational performance. She has studied aspects of job quality, such as scheduling practices, family leaves, and initiatives to support worker voice, and conducted related field experiments in a variety of settings from Fortune 500 firms to nursing homes and warehouses. So with that, please join me in welcoming Erin to facilitate today's program.
Thank you, Jen. Yeah. Great to see everyone. I too appreciate that you are taking some time to connect and be a part of this conversation, especially as the semester unfolds and things get busier and busier. We're rolling downhill towards the end of May. And if folks are interested, the middle section is open, and I'll just say that. It's my pleasure to introduce Jenny Weissbourd, who is a Sloanie and is a longtime friend and partner of IWER and also connected with Sloan Sustainability Initiative. And so it's kind of a little virtual welcome home. Jenny is program director with the Families and Workers Fund, where she leads grant making and partnerships to advance good jobs and identify equitable workforce pathways. She brings more than a decade of experience on advancing policies and practices that support economic mobility, and she is highly skilled in working with multiple stakeholders, sectors, and communities. Before joining the Families and Workers Fund, she was a leader at the Aspen Institute's Economic Opportunity Program. She also has experience guiding the development of food access initiatives at the Food Trust, along with a variety of other interesting experiences. She has a BA from Brown and then was here at MIT Sloan, where she did a dual degree with Harvard Kennedy School. And we are delighted to have you here. Welcome, Jenny.
Thanks, Erin. So good to be here. And I have to say, I used to be a regular at these sustainability lunches, so it really does feel like a bit of a homecoming.
That's great. That's great. So we're going to start by introducing the Families and Workers Fund. How was it established, and what are some of your goals? What is this thing?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So Families and Workers Fund is a $130 million pooled fund. We're supported by about 25 leading national philanthropies, folks like the Ford Foundation, the Gates Foundation, Schmidt Futures, and many others. And the story is basically that we were founded in 2020 in direct response to the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was a moment when all these national foundations were trying to move quickly and in a coordinated way to respond to the emergency and really help people achieve economic security. And so we brought those funds together to pool their dollars, and the Families and Workers Fund was born. And our focus is advancing economic opportunity, particularly for the communities that have been most locked out. So we focus on people of color, women, young people without a college degree, and people living in or near poverty. And we do the work through a mix of grant making and strategic partnerships with business and government, with a focus on 3 primary impact areas. The first is about advancing good jobs and inclusive workforce training. That's where I focus most of my time. The second is building an equitable and effective public benefit system. So we started during the pandemic moment with the unemployment insurance system and trying to help state agencies function better to meet people's needs. But we've expanded that work, and now we focus on other social safety net supports like SNAP or food stamps or Medicaid. And third, we support our partners across philanthropy to align behind shared priorities and strategies.
Great, thank you. It must have been interesting kind of being pulled together by COVID. You know, it's only been around 5 years, and yet those have been there have been varied crises at different moments, and a lot of work, I imagine, to kind of build coalitions and be both nimble and hearing from everyone. Yes. In the topic of climate jobs, I'm curious broadly, what do you think of as climate jobs? And then what are you imagining as the goal for supporting and encouraging high quality climate jobs?
Yeah. So let's see. What do we think of as climate jobs? You know, our focus has really been the set of jobs that the federal government focused on when they passed this series of bills over the last few years, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Sciences Act, that collectively invested about $2 trillion for climate and infrastructure projects that were projected to create about 12 million new jobs. So at that time, we said, wow, this is an enormous window of opportunity to really support the transition to net zero while also moving workers into these higher quality jobs. So we looked at sort of the universe of jobs that those bills were supporting in things ranging from, you know, construction to solar and so on. In terms of how we think about job quality, maybe a good place to start is, you know, why we focus on job quality to begin with.
Okay.
So we say in this country, you know, we often say, like, work is the core of the American dream. If you work hard, you should be able to build a better life for yourself, for your kids. But we see that in reality, it's about a third of working people in this country who can't meet their basic needs. So there's this crisis around job quality. You know, Gallup data tells us that only about 40% of Americans say that they're in a good job. So we know that most people aren't happy at work either. And that's what got us focused on this overarching question of both how can we train people, prepare them for the good jobs that already exist, and how do we raise the floor for workers so that more jobs are good family sustaining jobs. And the definition you see here is one that we worked on with the Aspen Institute and a group of partners from across business and policy and labor and workforce development, so that we could sort of collectively align on a broadly shared definition of what we mean when we talk about good jobs. The Families and Workers Fund launched this framework in 2022 with about 250 signatories, ranging from the SEIU, you know, major labor union for service workers, to Chipotle. So by design, this big tent, politically diverse, cross-sector coalition. And what you can see here is that when we think about what a good job is, we think it's a job that helps you get by, get ahead, and have a say. So it's things like, in economic stability, does it have family sustaining pay and benefits? In economic mobility, do you have access to training and growth opportunities? And then there's this piece around equity, respect, and voice in the workplace. So we're thinking about this intersection of good jobs and climate jobs, particularly, as I mentioned, since these major federal investments happened. Of course, some of those dollars are now paused, but many have already moved toward the ground. And we really want to make sure that they effectively support a clean energy transition. So we've done two things in our investments. First, making sure that there are enough trained and ready workers to meet this moment at a time where we're hearing a lot about historic labor shortage, and in industries where a disproportionate share of the workforce is retiring. And one of the ways we're thinking about making sure there are enough trained and ready workers is really helping to diversify the workforce, right? Because we know historically infrastructure and clean energy jobs haven't always included women and people of color. So thinking about how to really support effective training and bring those communities into this workforce. And second, how do we make sure these are actually good jobs? I've talked to solar panel installers who have part-time work, who don't get benefits, who are out there on the roof every day facing extreme weather, right? And so the question is, what can we do to make sure that all these new jobs being created are safe and family-sustaining jobs? And how can we do that in ways that also improve businesses' ability to efficiently and effectively deliver these projects? So those are the things we're working on at the fund, and happy to share specific grantee examples if that's helpful.
That's great. I love hearing that, and we'll dive into the examples. I actually had meant to start by saying I'm a job quality scholar, and I have been working on what are the feasible ways to improve job quality, particularly for low-wage workers, and asking questions about gender and racial equality and inequalities and opportunities. For me, this kind of applying those questions to the climate job sector is quite new. So I wanted to own that, and that's part of why I was eager to do this session. I did attend a very interesting seminar about a year ago, put on by the Urban Institute. Jenny, you may have supported that, I don't know. But one of the things that I learned from that session was they focused on three growing sectors, or three growing occupations within the clean energy sector: green construction, renewable energy generation, and energy efficiency and adaptation there. And they found, using a slightly different but related definition, that only a third of those occupations were currently classified as a good job, right? So we know this is growing. We know that this is a sector where there are huge needs, both for the climate issues and for our country's workforce development. But we want to actually build those in a way that is, leading to the goals that you laid out, Jenny. I thought another interesting thing from that was they had looked at 8 different cities across the US and really traced the composition of the occupations and the people who were working in related occupations. So similar background could be easily trained into those sectors. And if you think about it, especially when we think about construction and how it's historically who's gone into construction, there were gender gaps in current access that were very clear across the board. Another interesting thing from my perspective is that the gaps between Black workers and white workers differed across the 8 cities, which also kind of suggests that there are specific strategies that some locations are following to bring in a diverse and more bring in workforces that are more representative of their communities. So those were the examples on my mind, but Jenny, can we switch to an example on your mind of what have you seen that both prioritizes good jobs and seems to be effective in terms of workforce development?
Yeah, and thanks for lifting up that data, Erin. I remember when that came out too. Really important work. So maybe starting on the training side and what good looks like as it relates to helping bring different kinds of communities into these in-demand jobs. What might account for some of those differences you described across cities, right? So one of the grantees that we support at the Families and Workers Fund is an organization based in Philadelphia called Power Corps. And it connects young people who are facing barriers to opportunity with quality green infrastructure jobs. So this is an organization that works with about 98% people of color, all young people. And many of the people in this program have been involved with the criminal legal system, are disconnected from school and work. And they come to Power Corps, and what they get is effective paid training along with a set of other wraparound supports, mental health support, helping participants connect with things like transportation and childcare, which we know can often stand in the way of successful completion of a training program and success in a job. And as a result, more than 90% of the people that go through this training program end up not just connecting to a living wage quality job, but staying in that job and advancing in that job over time.
Interesting. Yeah.
What we're focused on at the fund is scaling this across multiple cities, right? It's a program, it's designed as a kind of cross-sector collaboration where there's always a government entity at the table and a community-based organization and employers at the table. So we're helping bring that model to at least 10 cities across the country now. So that's one example of what it can look like to do well on the training side. When it comes to other kinds of job quality interventions, one example that I really love to lift up is a program called Better Builder that's based in Texas. And what we learned in this work is that the Texas construction industry is the most dangerous and deadly in the country when you look across states. About 60% of workers say they've never had safety training, and a worker dies on the job every 3 days, which is just really shocking. So this group of construction workers in Texas came together and said, we've had enough. They jointly developed a set of good job standards for the industry, and they started finding ways to partner with business and with government to embed their standards in major development projects. And one of the first big and I think really interesting wins for them was a partnership with the Travis County, Texas county government to get these standards built into permitting. Now, I know this is a little bit wonky, but the outcome is pretty cool. In Travis County, like a ton of other places, it can take years to get a building permit, right? So developers get frustrated with the process. What Better Builder helped set up with the county is that if you're a developer who agrees to uphold these good job standards, you can jump the line. So you get your project built faster. The city's cutting through its permitting backlogs, and construction workers have these safe living wage jobs. So win for everybody. It started with the county, and then the same standards were approved on a federally funded overhaul of Austin's transit system to green it, a $10 billion project. And now we have tens of thousands of Texas workers who are building this project and all have safe and living wage jobs because these standards have been implemented.
Those are two super interesting examples. I want to ask for a little more detail. It's fine if you don't have it on the tip of your tongue. But I'm curious, how does Power Corps work with employers, and what are they hoping for from the program? What do they see as valuable from that partnership?
Yeah, so they work with both public sector and private sector employers. I mentioned that city governments are always at the table. For example, here in Philadelphia, some of the public sector jobs are things like the city's water department or parks and recreation. And some of that is climate resilience work. And then there's also separate private sector infrastructure work in partnership with unions and construction firms. And some other green energy jobs. They have a solar program as well. So in terms of why those employers come to the table, it's connected to the workforce needs that I mentioned earlier. Interestingly, city water departments have a huge challenge filling jobs. Construction is an industry where we're seeing the workforce aging out, and there are major workforce needs. So there's the talent need, but there's also not just the desire for people who want to, for people to fill these jobs, but also these are jobs that, candidly, not everybody sticks with, right? Like, you have to be
tough, yeah.
There's challenging jobs. So part of what I think is really smart and useful about PowerCore's model is this apprenticeship-like earn and learn model where these young people are on job sites for a while, and by the time they're formally placed in an employment site, they've really tried it out, and they know that they're committed to it and they're there to stay. And we see that in terms of the retention. And employers really value that. Yes, not just have they attracted people, but they have attracted people with a long-term commitment who can grow in the role. And these are really dedicated folks. I mean, the fact that people come into this program having faced some really significant challenges often means that when they get into a well-paid career pathway, they're really, very dedicated, engaged workers, and employers see the benefits of that.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And that reminds me more broadly, the research on second chance hiring or hiring of people who have had some connection to the criminal justice system suggests there's often high levels of loyalty and a real appreciation of being welcomed and treated with respect as people move into those roles. Great. Let's talk a little bit about how you do the work. So something that is already clear are the different parties who are involved. From your seat, as and at the Families and Workers Fund, how do you set up those kinds of multi-stakeholder coalitions or partnerships? What are some of the challenges? And, I think I'm also thinking of, we talk a lot at MIT Sloan and certainly in the Sustainability Initiative about systems change approaches, but you're trying to make something concrete happen in one locale with its own specific context and cast of characters. So can you share how you approach that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think much like all sustainability work, this job quality work has to be cross-sector for it to be effective. We can't do it without, without business at the table, without government, without workers themselves helping shape how we do it. In terms of how we bring those different stakeholders to the table, I think it's partly about really showing the value for each of the stakeholders of this work, right? That we have to be talking to the private sector because they're providing many of the jobs. And we have to be demonstrating to companies that it's in their business interest for some of the reasons we've already talked about, right? When you invest in the workforce, it helps you attract and keep talent. It helps drive engagement and productivity. There's lots of great research on how diversifying your workforce can lead to really important business benefits, right? So demonstrating that case, not just by showing the research, but by implementing programs that really deliver those kinds of outcomes. And then I think, the public sector is important to have at the table for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that they set the rules, that when it comes to wages and safety standards and so on, it's really critical to have government setting the floor and also developing strong public workforce systems that support training goals. And so I think it's about kind of making the economic development case, showing why this is really important for success in a region, and showing that there's real political will for this work, which there is. It's an interesting thing, it's an area where we see, even in a really kind of contentious time like this, keeping support for these ideas of good jobs and quality workforce training, particularly in certain sub areas.
Sure.
And then nonprofits, unions, worker-led organizations need to be part of this work too. They're often the ones delivering training, advocating for better working conditions. And the reason for them to be at the table is obvious. I think the harder part is, how do you sell to business and to government, the value of collaborating in that way. But I think we've seen that when you can get a pilot going, everybody sees the benefits, right? So an example of this kind of work, we're supporting the Baltimore Climate and Infrastructure Workforce Hub. And basically there's this coalition of business and government agencies and training organizations that have come together to build better infrastructure in Baltimore and provide good jobs. And, the training organization is preparing diverse workers for the most in-demand jobs. The businesses are seeing the benefits of that because they're getting these trained workers that they need to fill their open roles. And then government is able to deliver these publicly funded projects on time and on budget because these other partners are already there working in a coordinated way to get things done. So I think the more we can do this work well in coordination on the ground and lift up those outcomes, the more this work is going to sort of scale on its own.
So even more specifically, like, what does effective coordination and convening require? I don't know, maybe that's too abstract a question, but I'm wondering about that. Like, or what are the characteristics of partners that make you excited and hopeful about a new program that you're looking to support?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So I think, there's something around sort of shared values. We are very intentional about bringing together partners who may approach these issues in different ways, working across political lines and so on. But at the same time, I think part of what allows the work to be effective is that partners may be coming from different places but have a shared set of goals, right? Like we all in a city want to see the bridges stay up and new parks get built and so on. So if we start from a place of, we want that end goal, and we also want to do it in a way where more people have jobs and more people have good jobs, which is something that most people can really agree on, that helps kind of grease the wheels for good conversation and good partnership. So, I think there's a shared value starting point. I think there's something around structuring these partnerships in smart ways, so that there's kind of shared responsibility and governance authority, but also efficiency. I mean, I think this is something we're talking about a lot right now. The ways that, that we're at a time where we're seeing this really mounting mistrust in government in particular, but also mistrust in business in some contexts, right? And so I saw some great Just Capital data on that recently. Some of the ways that we're seeing a lot of skepticism around business leadership, right? So I think there's a kind of shared imperative to deliver projects well for constituents, to rebuild trust. And so I think part of the effective design of these kind of collaborations is both like, how do we all have a voice, but also how do we orient around big goals that have an attached, an immediate timeline, and have regular checkpoints so we can make sure we're getting things done, because that's what's going to create goodwill for the project.
It's a great point. I mean, I think especially when we have these broad definitions of what good jobs are, and when we know that sustainability work and so much other kind of work oriented to policy change or to changing people's experiences requires multiple stakeholders, we're always trying to figure out the balance between being sure that we're surfacing the multiple voices and having holistic perspectives on what is needed and what's the problem we're trying to solve, but then trying to clearly solve a problem in the short term so that people stick with it and don't kind of start to question the value or doubt it. Yeah. Sounds familiar. Yeah. Anything else you want to talk about how you do the work? One question on my mind was, you mentioned scaling the power core initiative or approach. What are the challenges to scaling, or what's the most exciting example of scaling that comes to mind from your recent work? Either a great example or a barrier.
Yeah, we really strongly orient towards scale in our work because we were set up as a short-term pooled fund that in this sort of window of opportunity moment, right? Like I think part of what we saw from COVID as it relates to good jobs work, I'd been working on these issues for a while, and it often felt like they were sort of marginal issues. Only a few people were talking about them. And then we had this moment where the pandemic exposed what essential workers are experiencing and how important they are to the basic functioning of our economy. We were all out there banging pots and pans, and at the same time, companies were losing workers and trying new and creative things to attract workers. The federal government was investing all this money, so it was like a set of circumstances that really, I think, changed the national conversation and brought these issues of job quality into the public eye in a really powerful way. And we actually see, there's good survey data that says these days, the number one thing the public judges companies on is how they treat their workforce. So I think these issues are really timely, and our feeling was, okay, we have this window of opportunity. We hope this lasts forever. We hope everyone keeps talking and thinking about job quality. But even if that doesn't happen, we have a moment now where we can really drive change at scale. So the way we think about that is we look for proven programs that have a pathway to grow, that is often tied to government dollars, actually, or large scale private investments. So like the Better Builder example I gave earlier, the story there is it's this great program that proves itself at a very local level. And then suddenly at this moment where billions of dollars of federal investments are flowing in, how do we use that as, how do we creatively form a partnership between government agencies and business and this worker-driven entity so that a really large-scale project attaches the standards? And I should say, right now, this Better Builder program is expanding across Texas, and we're funding an organization based in Florida called WeCount that is trying to replicate the model in Florida.
Interesting.
So, and similarly, by engaging the Miami-Dade County government and using some of the same techniques. So some of it's about replication, some of it's about seizing moments where there are significant dollars flowing to expand things, and we can make sure those dollars move in the most effective ways that embed strategies that we know work, that focus on equity and economic mobility.
Very interesting. And I hear both, like the need to move fast, but then you don't want people to just adopt something that they made up. Recently you're trying to hold up the tested programs and the programs where you've seen the stakeholders will come together and it is feasible in achieving these goals. So you mentioned that you have been doing this for a while, and I wondered if we could switch to the kind of career advice, career story part of the conversation. Can you tell us about your career path and how you came to be doing this work?
Yeah, absolutely. And just one thing I feel like I should have said about our work is I do think we do this best when we center workers themselves and their experience driving the strategy, and that's something we try to be really intentional about too. We have what we call an Essential Leaders Council of frontline workers across industries like healthcare and domestic work and teaching, farm work, who guide our grant making. And that's been hugely useful to me to kind of test ideas and make sure that I'm actually operating in ways that will meet people's needs on the ground.
So can I follow up on that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, then we'll circle back. So what are you hearing from people in frontline positions in clean energy sector or sustainable jobs as you're defining them?
Yeah, good question.
And what are the concerns or the frustrations or the hopes?
Yeah. So I think there's a first issue, which is that I think a lot of people who need jobs and need better jobs don't always know about these opportunities. That has to do with the networks that have shaped these sectors historically. And we talked a bit about that. In some construction subsectors, it's 90% white and male, and there's a lot of sort of family relationships that shapes who gets what opportunity. So there's this first fundamental issue of many people who could benefit from being in these jobs, not always knowing they're there or how to get into them. But in terms of the people that are in them, I think some of the challenges we're hearing are just around, job quality vulnerabilities in certain sectors. I mentioned the construction example in Texas.
Sure.
The one that comes to mind is we fund an organization called Resilience Force that focuses on disaster recovery. And something that really surprised me when I learned about it, especially given the times that we're in, I think it's, close to 300 major natural disasters since, I think it's, since 2004 or something like that. Trillions of dollars invested in addressing natural disasters. So this is a really big need. What surprised me was that the workforce that comes in to address these issues once they happen is largely a migrant workforce, many undocumented people, and they're traveling from disaster site to disaster site. And these jobs are extremely precarious. They are very unsafe. There's a lot of not just low wages, but wage theft. People, brought in to do a job and then ultimately not paid for it. And it has consequences. It not only has consequences for the workers, it also has consequences because, if your community was destroyed and was being rebuilt, wouldn't you want people who were trained and supported to be the ones building it so we get to higher quality projects? So we have actually a couple of different frontline workers in that sector who we interact with regularly who've talked about just some of the realities that they've faced on those work sites and what they're doing to change them. This is another area where their Resilience Force is a worker-led organization, and they've come up with their set of good job standards, and they've figured out how to work with government and with developers, businesses, to attach those standards to projects so that the projects are meeting certain standards. Very interestingly, they've created a new classification of jobs and a new apprenticeship program that's approved at the national level that's focused on climate resilience. So that we recognize how important these workers are. We start training them in ways that benefit everybody. And we make sure that once they get into these jobs, the workers are supported so that they can deliver the best quality product.
Yeah, very interesting. This kind of climate crisis creating both these new needs and these new vulnerabilities for people who are perhaps not able or fully covered by existing labor standards, or for whom kind of pushing for enforcement of existing labor standards feels risky. Very interesting example. Okay, well, let's circle back to the story of your career briefly, or medium briefly.
I'll do the quick version because you summarized it nicely earlier, Erin. Probably won't surprise anyone after what I've said when I say that I've spent my whole career focused on economic mobility issues. Early on, I worked for a small private consulting firm that supports nonprofits and government agencies with strategy and planning. Then I went to the Food Trust, focused on increasing healthy food access. We were working closely with the Obama administration at that time to scale the work nationally. And that was actually the time when I first started getting interested in these job quality issues. We were supporting a lot of job creation by financing grocery store and other food retail development in food deserts in these historically disinvested communities. And I think, like many other people, I sort of had this naive idea that, well, if you create jobs for people, you'll be able to move them out of poverty. And the reality that I was seeing was that a lot of these jobs were not actually good enough jobs to change people's economic realities. That, if you're working in a grocery store, it may be low wage with a tough schedule. And so I started thinking more about why so many working people in this country are still living in poverty. And so when I went to grad school, I had this curiosity about these issues. And I was doing a policy degree at HKS. I was doing my MBA at Sloan, and I ended up spending a lot of time at IWER, including supporting research on worker voice through an independent study. and really working closely with and getting to know a few professors who ended up kind of setting me on the career path that I'm on now. Actually, I remember in the winter of my last year at Sloan, I took a trip to DC and had a series of meetings that some professors had helped me set up. One of those was with my future boss at the Aspen Institute. Out of that meeting came a consulting project that I worked on in the spring of my last year at Sloan. And then I moved to DC when I graduated to take a job offer as associate director of Aspen's Workforce Strategies Initiative. And I was there for a few years and then transitioned from there to the Families and Workers Fund in 2021.
That's great. Yeah, that's terrific to hear. Well, I think we will open it up. I have a couple questions in mind, but we want to be sure that we have time for those in the audience to take this in whatever direction you want. So the floor is open. Yes. Can you introduce yourself just very briefly? I don't know, Jenny, whether you're going to be able to see people speaking, but it will help kind of ground the question.
My name is Yizhi. I'm a first year MBA student at Sloan. I'm curious to hear more about the scaling work that you do, and more specifically, just like on the sustainable revenue and funding side of things, because it's incredibly hard to train workers and place them into family sustaining jobs. I think a lot of organizations spend up to $10,000 per impact case. So curious, how do you bring together different sources of funding? What creative, innovative, financing structures do you pursue? And any lessons learned from there?
Great. Were you able to hear that well?
I was.
Terrific.
And it's a really good question. It's actually one we talk about a lot. And we have a particular initiative called Powering Climate and Infrastructure Careers that's focused on this particular set of industries and workers that we've been talking about today. And I would say this is probably the biggest challenge that they've faced, right? Like finding given the realities of our public workforce system and how expensive this work can be, and frankly, the fact that employers aren't investing more in training, it is really hard to do this work at scale. So I think some of it is definitional, right? That we think about scale a little bit differently for certain kinds of training programs than we do for some of our other good jobs work. That a program that, like PowerCore that I mentioned earlier, that works deeply with a few hundred people a year, we think is a really valuable program. And in that case, scale is bringing it up to a few thousand. And the way that we're doing it is by, we wouldn't be able to, for example, in Philly, in the home side of PowerCore, there's not a world where we help them serve 1,000 people in Philly, not only because of resource constraints like the ones you mentioned, but also because the nature of the work is they achieve the kinds of success metrics that I shared with you by working really deeply with people, helping them meet a range of needs. And so we just have to think about scale a little bit differently in that context. But in that case, it is, okay, what are the other cities around the country that are having similar kind of workforce gaps, that have access to usually a public funding stream, some combination of, maybe it's these federal climate and infrastructure dollars, maybe it's a city or state budget, maybe there are employers coming to the table that are willing to invest, and bringing the model to these other places where there's a resource. We are doing some exploratory work right now around financing with social finance and other partners, particularly to think about using models like income share agreements that we've seen help finance education. Like, how do we think about if you provide an employer with a trained worker, whether they might be able to compensate you for that on the other side, and how that could help sustain and grow training programs. We also think about the federally funded public workforce system and how those dollars could, both how we get expanded, but especially how that program could work better. So we look for the cases where there is either an employer or government provided funding stream that can help a program grow, but we also recognize that this is a large scale structural problem.
Any follow-up on that?
I do have a quick follow-up question. On the federal grants part and the pass-through grants to the federal government, I think the budgetary process happens around mid-year. Like, I'm just curious, like, what is your anticipated impact of the current administration on the next fiscal year and the years after in terms of, the federal funding to the job training programs?
There's a question about perhaps climate specific, but I think you're also saying just general workforce development. Can you see into a crystal ball or?
I think particularly in the current context, it's really hard to predict. There's been so much. What we hear when we talk to our state and local partners is just a sense of real sort of chaos and uncertainty about what dollars will and won't move. As it relates to the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act dollars that fund sort of core training, those are due to be reauthorized, and it's on a hold right now, and there's questions about what that means. I think, as it relates to the infrastructure and climate investments, we know that many of the dollars that hadn't moved yet are now on hold, and there's real uncertainty. I think we can probably expect, on the one hand, I think the current administration still cares and talks about certain kinds of training. For example, there's an interest in apprenticeship models, but they're a different kind. They're more of an employer-driven model than our traditional government-driven model. So I don't think that training dollars are going away altogether, but I think we can expect much smaller scale investment probably than was flowing the last few years.
Great. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm a first-year PhD student in the Institute for Data Systems and Society.
Great.
I think my question was on like the time delay between for example, the example given with like natural disaster response. Like now there's recognition at the national level of like this special type of apprenticeship needed, but just thinking about what is the time delay of like these, I guess, workers being exposed to like conditions that are adverse to like getting that recognition and then to like getting standards maybe like implemented at like a meaningful scale, and like how long that process might take, knowing that it can differ for like different, I guess, like, realms.
So how do we move at the pace we would like to, or something close to it, given a very complex both system of organizing workers, identifying needs, and policy change?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, I think the reality is like the delay is longer than it should be, and we have lots of people all over the country who are in jobs that are very difficult on a number of different levels. So that's a fundamentally it's a huge problem, and when we're working with government-driven solutions in particular, we all know there are long time lags to institutionalize things. I think where we've seen some meaningful success, that there's often instances, I think, where worker-led organizations are able to pursue multiple avenues at once. They're talking directly with businesses and trying to, or in cases where they can organize and unionize, they're using that mechanism to change practices at the same time as they are talking with government at all levels. Often local government is moving faster, state government a little slower than that, federal government the slowest path to change. So I think it's about like pursuing multiple strategies, having a tolerance for incrementalism, knowing that this takes time because it's deep structural change work, but that it's worth the time, especially if at each phase you're having some wins for very vulnerable workers.
Thank you, Jenny. I mean, I think I would also just share, sometimes I feel frustrated with the idea of, quote, narrative change, or that we gotta kind of change the cultural expectations. But there's also a reality that good jobs conversations, the more that they're elevated, then the more that people can imagine that someone like me could expect more. And the more that there is organizing via labor movements of all kinds, as well as policy initiatives, then there's a sense of kind of being ready to push. And unfortunately, the frustration is likely to be there, but sometimes that frustration is then energizing for the next round of imagining some improvements there. Other questions? Yes, Emma.
I have a question online similar to a topic that came up earlier, but kind of speaking to a more global implication. Anurag said, given the new administration, both public and private sector jobs are going to be affected given funding cuts and new decisions. What will be the ripple effects of these decisions on global climate action, whether in the climate tech industry, funding, philanthropy, et cetera?
I heard that as a kind of, the folks who've been working on this from different places are also facing challenges now. You may have heard a different question within there. Any response?
Yeah, so is part of the, did I hear right that part of the question was about rural context?
Global.
Global, okay. Yeah, interesting question. So most of my work and expertise is domestic, admittedly. I do think these, I think as our economy is increasingly global, it's important to bring a global frame to these questions, especially because we know, sometimes there's conversation about, well, if we increase job quality for US jobs, are those jobs going to get outsourced to other places where labor is less expensive? And of course, as it relates to the climate question, we won't achieve our global goals unless we're implementing global solutions. So I think, candidly, with the caveat that my expertise is limited, I think there's not enough of a global conversation on the intersection of these issues. Like, how do we think together about global solutions to climate and economic mobility issues? I certainly haven't participated in a lot of those conversations. I think they're conversations we need to be having, but because these are highly complex systems change issues, I think people are probably daunted by taking them on at that scale. So I think it's just a really important question and one we should continue to address, as this movement grows over time.
I'm not sure this is responsive, but I think one of the challenges, on the one hand, I would like to see us borrowing from successes elsewhere for creating high quality climate jobs and in this sector. On the other hand, it's like the institutional structure, the policy infrastructure, the safety nets, the training systems, the kind of educational system that takes people through training and skills beyond a college pathway, that is distinctive to the US. And so we have cobbled together systems. There's still more to learn, I am sure, but I think it's a case where our patchwork and our history, our kind of policy legacy of how we do things, then means we need to find the examples that are local and get those spread as well. Other questions? I will ask the classic Sloaney lunch question. What piece of advice would you give to a Sloan student, or we have people from across the institute, to an MIT student who wants to pursue this line of work? So let's talk broadly, sustainability, social impact, or perhaps public service work.
Yeah. And by the way, forgive me for standing up a couple minutes ago while my dog was slamming against the door. So okay, I'm gonna do a two-pronged piece of advice based on my own experience. I think the first one is like, this is maybe particularly for Sloanies, but it's probably broader than that. Don't let peer pressure get in your way. You know, in my class, only 1% of students went on to work in the nonprofit sector, so maybe it's basically just me. I had an offer at a tech company. It was really hard to trust my gut and do social impact work when all my friends were going to tech and consulting, right? And those were clearer and more straightforward paths that they could pursue. You know, they knew by winter in many cases, like that's where I'm headed. And there was something really appealing about that. So I found that really challenging, and ultimately I'm really glad I made the choice I did to do work that for me felt more personally meaningful. You know, I think everybody has different needs, but whatever your needs are, like trust your instincts. And if you think impact work is the thing that will make you happier and more satisfied, just want to encourage you to pursue it, even though I think there are incentives pushing you in different directions. The second piece is, if you do opt to pursue the impact-oriented work, it does require being a little more scrappy and networking more actively. You probably picked up on some of that when I was describing my experience. You know, I think for me, it required like doing a bunch of informational interviews in person when I could. I think finding ways to volunteer or intern for organizations that you want to work for when you can be really helpful. And then I think just sort of being patient around timeline, because it might be slower. And I'm also really happy to be a resource if I can be helpful. I think you all have my contact information on slides, but it's Jenny@familiesandworkers.org.
Terrific. That is much appreciated. And I think that, you know, one of the great things about the Sustainability Initiative is that those resources and those connections are something that Jen and team like really actively want to pursue. And I did want to say IWER is also of trying to up our game with Dahae Kim's help, Assistant Director Dahae Kim here, in more proactively making connections and being a resource for people. And just a little bit about us, we can offer some course advising. We have ongoing research seminars almost every Tuesday. And then on April 15th, the People and Organizations Club and IWER will be co-sponsoring a conversation with former U.S. Secretary of Labor, Julie Su, on kind of the current moment of the economy and the lessons from her experiences. So feel free to reach out to us if this is of interest as well. We'd be very pleased to help make connections. So thank you, Jenny, and thank you all for being here. Special thanks to Jen and Emma and Dahae for pulling this together. And I think people have your email, and we may be able to offer other ways to connect as well. Take care. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Good to be with you all.